Welcome to Live Life in the Spirit. I'm Pastor Penny Schulz.
And I'm Kristen Scharrenberg. We are so glad you're joining us as we explore relationships and really everything that goes with that topic. You're not going to want to miss any of these episodes.
So if you have missed one or you're just tuning in for the first time, we're glad you're here. But you can always go back to YouTube or Rumble, any of our podcast sites to catch those that you missed.
That's true. And you can also catch all of our content and read our blog on our website at livelifeinthespirit.com. So our first week, we talked about healthy relationships, what that looks like, and we covered that question, do we have a perfect model to follow?
I'm glad you asked that question. Why, yes, we do. And unlike most of the advice that you're going to hear throughout all the podcast media that's out there, in the secular world, we come at all of this from both a scientific perspective, but also, most importantly, from a biblical perspective as well.
It's true.
Which is grounded and rooted in truth. And we will explore some of the scriptures that back that up. What are boundaries? Oh, we hear that word all the time in our culture. It is a hot button topic.
It's thrown around a lot. And I would say misused quite a bit.
I would agree. So Kristen here has the degree in psychology, and she has dealt a lot with all this kind of stuff, even in professional line of work, and then just even, life experiences too. We've all had them. I mean, if we've been around the sun a few times,
You've had to either set a boundary, crossed a boundary, or somewhere in between.
Or learned a new one.
That's right.
So what would your definition of boundaries be?
I think just as a broad definition, it would be anything that you put in place that's meant to protect you from harm. And that could, I know that's vague, but we'll get into that a little bit more. But any line in the sand, so to speak, that is meant to protect.
Okay. Well, I actually heard from Dr. Henry Cloud, and so this is not mine, but to kind of break this down into a little bit more of a layman's term for those of us that don't have a degree in psychology, although I did take a lot of psychology. But if you look at the definition as a simple way, think of a property line. With whatever structure you're living in, there is a property line that defines your property,
right?
That space. What's yours versus what's your neighbor's. So we live out in the country. We're on 5 acres, and we had to have a surveyor come out to tell us exactly what ours was, so that way that the farmer wasn't planting on our ground.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're in town and you want to put up a fence, you have to know where your property line is to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you look at it in that term, that would be the boundary.
That's right.
Around where you have. Why do we have those? Well, as Dr. Cloud said, there's like 3 main reasons why you have boundaries. It's who's in control of that property. And if you own it, and even if you're renting it, you have the space as opposed to the neighbor. Like, if you have to mow your own grass,
right?
You're
responsible for that, right?
Right. So you can decorate it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're given permission, you can paint inside, or you can plant some flowers, you can do whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And your neighbor can't say anything about the color that you're painting your living room or the outside of the house, even whoever owns it.
Right. So the second will be having freedom of choices. So not only can they not do what they want to do on your property, but you get to do what you want to do with that property. So for instance, you can decide who gets to come onto your property and who doesn't. And while they're there, you can decide what they're allowed to do and what you're not going to tolerate.
And 3, freedom equals responsibility. You can't have one without the other. You have responsibility for that property, which means you have to what? You have to mow the yard, you have to maintain everything and keep it up to code, and so
take out the trash and make sure the sidewalk's cleared off, all those fun things.
Okay, so if that's what we're looking at with a house, it's really easy to define property lines, boundary lines, and what comes in and goes out of that. Now let's take that from the physical space and let's move it to our lives. Mm-hmm. Because that's really at the heart what we're talking about with boundaries.
It is. So boundaries within relationships have some similar characteristics to boundaries on a property. So you have physical boundaries in a relationship and with your person. So I decide who I'm going to let be physically close to me. So if everybody kind of has a bubble or a personal space, and we get to decide who comes into that and then what we allow them to do once they get there. So it's very similar to that home analogy.
Well, then emotional boundaries, that gets a little harder to define.
It does.
Of course, it's respect for each other's feelings. I have the right to say if you choose to call me names, and then I don't have to tolerate it, that I can limit you to my physical space, kind of thing. If you make fun of me for crying at a movie, I can choose then my boundaries, and I'm not going to go to the movie with you. Or it could be a language. For some of you, maybe that's a thing. Maybe you have family members, or maybe some friends or friends of a spouse or something like that that come over that use really, really foul language, and you just don't tolerate that. That can be a boundary.
And you can use a physical boundary and say, if you're going to do that,
Take it
needs
out
to
in
be
the garage.
out to the garage, or so that it's out of your
It's
earshot.
20 below and it's snowing. Or it could even be something like excessive drinking or lewd behavior or any of that kind of stuff. Using feelings, guilting.
Guilt is a big one that people use and use emotions against each other. So if you leave, I'll kill myself. Or if you do this, I'll never be happy again.
I'll never talk to you again.
Using our emotions against us, and then just not respecting each other's emotions. And then there's mental boundaries. And so that would be respect for each person being allowed to have their own personal opinions and beliefs about it. It could be about anything. It could be about parenting. It could be about religion. It could be about politics. Well, sports, though, I'm not sure.
Only if you're a
Nebraska Chiefs fan. That's right. We can respect each other's boundaries and differences of opinion on those things by even just agreeing to disagree. So there are ways to do that without being disrespectful.
Well, having boundaries is knowing person's triggers as well and respecting that. Like if you know I don't like to go to a particular place, or say I don't like to watch horror flicks, but then you're like, well, if you keep persisting and keep pushing to go,
then you're not being
you make it
respectful.
feel, I won't be your friend anymore. Healthy boundaries would be knowing a person's triggers. I mean, if you're not just an acquaintance, and respecting that.
Right.
So if you were to say, I don't like to go to that particular place at all, well, then I'm not going to push for that. Or if you say, you know what, horror flicks are not my thing, then I'm not going to try to keep persistently pushing you towards going to a movie that you don't want to do. And then throwing on I won't be your friend anymore if you don't do this or this.
And then on the flip side of that, the way a boundary being respectful in both directions would be if we're friends and I know that you don't care for horror movies, but I absolutely love them, which is not true, by the way, they scare me, I'm a wuss. Then you wouldn't care if I had another friend and I went and saw horror flicks with them. Like, I would respect the fact that that's never going to be something we do, but you're going to respect the fact that I'm going to go do that on a different time.
So you are in control of your feelings and what you do. And the whole point is they cannot violate your head or your heart. Now, what I did really like about what Dr. Cloud had said, he had made a mention of when you think of your home and you think of boundaries, they're not walls. I talked about putting up a fence, but even if you put up a fence, typically they're not completely walled in like the front is. And even if people come in, you have a door, right? It's not a solid wall with a moat and alligators. Well, some people kind of have that.
It's true.
But there is a door, and that door opens. And that's the point. You choose who you allow in and who you allow out. I mean, if you were to have a robber or a ammo salesman or something like that coming in, probably not going to let them in. But I'm joking. I don't even know if they do Amway anymore. I don't know. It used to be a thing. But at the same time, if it's somebody that you want to let in, you're going to open that door.
Correct.
It's not barricaded.
No. And that's just it. Boundaries are there to protect everyone in the relationship, in any relationship. And it helps you to feel loved, it helps you to feel respected, and it helps build self-confidence and self-worth. Because if I say, okay, this is what I'm comfortable with, and you respect that, then I know you've heard me, and you care that this is how I say things need to go for me to feel safe. And then that actually can allow even for more closeness and all of that kind of stuff, because that person is now a safe person.
And I'm glad you said closeness. That's what I was thinking, because if you respected the first boundary or the boundary that's been put in place and they can trust you, you can trust that person with so much more.
For sure.
And maybe, depending on what boundaries first started up, some of those can maybe move, and some of them are the non-negotiables.
Right.
And that's you feel more freedom within those boundaries to change.
Absolutely.
Well, it all comes down to what?
Communication. That is 100% the key to any kind of boundaries, and especially to establishing healthy ones, because you have no idea what I'm comfortable with and what I'm not comfortable with if I don't tell you.
That's right. We can't read each other's minds, even our spouses. Sometimes we can, but we can't always.
No, we can't.
Well, boundaries are meant to protect, not to control. And this is another thing that I think gets skewed with that. Some people can use boundaries as a controlling factor.
Right. So a boundary is meant, if I set a boundary, it's going to be about what I allow in my space, but it has nothing to, it has to be something that would impact me physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually even. If it's not, then I'm not using it appropriately. I'm just trying to control your behavior because I don't like it, or I don't, it's very different. It's very different.
So let's look at the different kind of boundaries. Most all of us have a workplace of some sort.
True.
So that can actually probably be right at the core of that at the beginning. That's the hard one, because you're dealing with a lot of people. You're dealing with people who could be anywhere from external to intimate a little. There's many different kind of boundaries that can go into place. So like time. Time is probably one of the biggest boundary issues that we have, that we fall, or that we fail miserably.
It's true. So if you look at boundaries in the workplace with time, it could be as simple as somebody wanting to come and talk to you while you're trying to be productive and get something done. Well, that's all well and good. Maybe you're friends, but if you don't establish the fact that, hey, we're only going to talk on our break, or we can maybe grab lunch, then that can be setting up the fact that you're using work time to talk to your friends, and neither one of you are being productive, and that could get you in trouble, and that could just lead to a bad situation all the way around.
Unless you're a pastor, and they pay you to do that.
Well, that is true. I guess it depends on the job.
But it is, because I have been, I wasn't always a pastor. I say I just play one on TV, but I used to be in the medical profession, and it was so much like that too. You had things you had to do, but you were also interacting with everybody. But if somebody wanted to talk, you tried to give them a little bit of time, but you really have to protect that. Then I was a painting contractor. My husband was construction. Now he's in diesel mechanics. But you know what? When you have a client that comes out and then wants to talk for an hour and a half, well, then your time is money. And if they're just talking, you're trying to be nice, but you can't get your work done.
Right. It makes it difficult. And that's another really important boundary to establish with work. Let's say, if you're an hourly employee, generally speaking, if you're at work, you're working. If you're not at work, you're not working. Salaried employees have a different animal to negotiate with, and that's time. So most of them don't have a set schedule, they don't have set hours, and if there's not enough time for the hourly employees to get things done, then salaried employees are expected often to pick up the slack. The problem with that lies if you work for a company that's the culture, and that seems to be the expectation. You need to know that going in and make those boundaries clear. I'm not willing to take my computer home and work evenings and weekends on a regular basis. Maybe I'll do that twice a month, a couple times, whatever. Establishing that, because if not, then you're setting up that pattern ahead of time, and they're assuming that you're going to be willing to do that, even if you're not.
I know for anybody who's in ministry, that's a really hard one. I mean, I think pastors have it the worst. You know, when I did radiology, I was on call all the time, so I was used to my beeper going off, or that was before cell phones, or then cell phone. But, you know, now it's, when people think of it, or they're available, or they get home, then that's when they want to text or message or call. Or if it's your day off, well, it doesn't matter if they need something, or if there's a crisis or whatever, you do it. But in the process of doing that, then that makes boundaries hard to set for family time. And you can't just leave it at the office. It goes home with you, and it's all day, all night. And
I think it even makes it difficult for you to set days off. I mean, I've seen that so much. I can understand a crisis or an emergency, but even for people to, if there's something that could wait until it wasn't one of your days off, they tend not to. And that goes both ways. Communicating those boundaries is difficult.
Communicating and you know, and then that's on me, some of that, because I do know some pastors who've been very good. They've been very strict and almost turned offish for me, but now I understand a little more why they were very protective of this time. You do need that. Besides that, in a workplace, what other kind of boundaries do you have to deal with?
Well, we talked about that physical space, and culturally, there are so many variances in what people are comfortable with. So eye contact in the United States, that's hugely important. We feel disrespected if someone won't look us in the eye. There are a lot of cultures, Asian cultures in particular, looking someone in the eye is a sign of disrespect, especially if there is a, in their opinion, like a difference in stature between the two people. If some of those things aren't communicated, or you're at least not aware of it, both people can leave the situation feeling offended for the same thing because it went different directions. And even just how close we stand to each other. There are some cultures where that's normal, and other cultures where it's much more normal to have space. And so just, again, being aware and having those communications.
Well, and then that also gets down to sometimes in the workplace you have to deal with the boundaries of sexual harassment.
100%.
We have been much better, I would say, in the last decade about recognizing it, standing up for it, you know, putting measures into place. But a lot of that comes with just communication again, what you will allow to be said, what you won't allow.
Education,
how they touch. You know, because, yeah, if a guy comes up and he just puts his hand on your shoulder and he's just doing that to pat you, you know, you can say, oh, you know, so you have the far extreme. You have some people that could holler that was sexual harassment, and then you have the other far extremes.
Right.
Just communication.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's the biggest thing, you know, in a workplace, we talked about this a lot, establishing like what is acceptable in that workplace and what isn't. Let's say you've got a group of people that's very close knit, you've worked together for 4 or 5 years, you guys come in every morning, you give each other a hug, and somebody new comes in and sees that, they're going, what in the world have I gotten myself into? I don't want to hug anyone. I'm not a hugger, you know. So how do I navigate this workplace? Am I going to feel left out? Are they going to judge me? So you just have to be very, very aware of differences in what people are comfortable with. And I think just being aware that we often will get those traditions or get those patterns and established. And where in the work I've done, these unwritten workplace rules can really hang people up. So being aware of them and making sure you communicate them is so important.
Well, how about just boundaries on listening in on others' conversations? Like, okay, so let's say you go out for break or for lunch or whatever, and there's enough distance in between. And you're not just nonchalantly, I mean, because sometimes we just hear things, but when you're purposely listening in.
That is definitely breaking a boundary and just not being respectful in general. If a person, especially if a person took themselves over, they went and sat in the corner, they took themselves away, and you're going, oh man, they made that harder to hear. I'm gonna have to really listen, you know? Not good.
Or then to use that in the break room.
Yes.
Later. Okay, so how about with moving it from the workplace to home? And let's get into family and extended family. Like, I don't mean like your little nucleus family right now, but I'm talking about the family you came from, your mom and dad, your siblings, in-laws, sister-in-laws, brothers-in-laws, parent-in-laws. What does that look like when boundaries get crossed?
You know, that's actually probably one of the most difficult boundaries that we have to set and to follow and to negotiate and navigate through. We've joked that, you know, people always say, oh, you don't marry their family. Not true.
No, you definitely need to know what you're getting into beforehand, because I think if nothing else, and I can speak of this from experience too, but there needs to be more communication and those healthy boundaries put into place before you ever say, I do. Unfortunately, the problem is, for too many, when you're that young, you just want to kind of keep the peace, or you want to try it, you hope it gets better, or whatever. So you don't do that. You don't have those tough conversations. You don't put those boundaries in place because you don't want to look like the bad person.
Right. Hoping something will get better, red flag. No matter what it is.
It never works.
It doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter what it is.
You know, and for some people, I know I've heard this where they'll have like a sister-in-law or a brother-in-law who's always meddling or always, setting up good boundaries would be having your spouse say, listen, I'm not having that in this marriage. I love you dearly, but that's not going to cross this boundary. If they don't do that, though, then what happens?
Then that person is allowed to meddle, and it impacts your family, and it impacts your relationship, and it just can really mess things up.
Well, and it can go for years. You know, from experience. So if you have any family drama and they don't respect that time or that boundary, and their intention is nothing but to complain or to get the other person all worked up. If they do that on a daily basis, what's that affecting?
Well, it's affecting that person that has to listen to that on a daily basis.
And then it's affecting the spouse because now that person has been affected and it's ruined their entire night, which has now ruined that person's entire night. Yeah. And there is no couple time at all because it's still all back with the family. And so there has to come that point when the person is willing to stand up and say, these are the boundaries, and you can call between here and here, but then when that time comes up, we're done with a conversation. Or you can only call, on this night or this night, or...
Because it's about, so you talked about we're looking at the extended family. Our job is to protect that nucleus. This has become, and that's scriptural, we leave and we become one here.
Our mother and father and cleave to our spouse.
And so at some point in time, this has to become the priority. We're not saying that isn't important. Extended family is incredibly important, but this has to be the top priority. That spouse has to be. So if it's about holidays, that's a huge fight for so many families. Talking about that ahead of time and establishing those, we're going to spend this time with your family and this time with my family. And then families respecting those boundaries and saying, you've talked about it, you've let us know, and we're going to respect that.
Well, what about even the boundaries within that family nucleus? So the problem is with our culture, and this has been, I would say, the last 2 generations. Things have moved from being mom and dad and kids to being kids first and dad or mom or, and it just kind of fills in. I thought about that. We'll probably get into this a little more in another episode, but when did it really start? And I would say it is sports. And my kids were in sports, I was in sports. But here's the thing. When sports first started, they were at set times. On set days. There were boundaries. Because, Sunday morning was definitely a boundary you did not cross for church. And Wednesday nights was a boundary. It used to be that you did not cross because that was for youth and church and stuff. Well, then immediately we started encroaching on more of that. And it started with like high school or middle school, and then all of a sudden it's elementary, and then it kept getting lower and lower and lower. Now we're talking, 4-year-olds that are out for T-ball. Well, we can't do church because that's the only time we can do T-ball. And the problem is when you do that, then the kids start realizing that everything becomes about the kid. Well, if Tommy wants to be in this, he gets to do that. And if Sally wants to be in this, she gets to do that. Pretty soon they're in 14 different activities. Mom and Dad don't even see each other. There is no family time. There is no couple time. And then we kind of talked about, then you're not eating at home anymore. You're not sitting around the table talking. You're grabbing fast food. Well, the kids don't want to go here. They'll only go there. They'll only eat this. They'll only eat that. It becomes all about the kids because it's easier to comply than it is to fight.
Right.
And then pretty soon, what happens to that couple? You hear this all the time. The minute the kids finally graduate, what happens?
There's nothing left. Because they haven't had a relationship with each other since the kids came along and everything became about them. And that's not healthy because the reality is in the real world, it's not all about us. And so then we've raised up children who think the world should revolve around them.
Sun
because
goes up and down around them.
Because it sure did. And we're not saying that kids aren't important, don't get us wrong. But there has to be balance and you have to set boundaries. Your kids need to understand that mom and dad get to have time that's just for mom and dad, I remember just little things, being like what we watched on TV. It didn't always get to be what we picked as kids. Sometimes I watched a lot of John Wayne movies because that's what dad wanted to watch and that was okay. I grew up watching football a lot of times because when we sat down, dad worked a lot. So on the evenings, mostly on the weekends, if we all watched TV, he usually picked. Now that's not to say that he didn't ever let us pick, but it wasn't always about us. And you know what? I actually like some of those movies now and watching sports with my dad is one of my favorite things to do because I grew up doing that with him and it was a way that we could bond.
Well, for me, it was watching my parents. Every Friday night was date night. And, back then, and money was tight, and they didn't always do anything excessive. Like, a lot of times I remember they would go dancing, they took dancing lessons and stuff like that. Or they go to a movie or just whatever. That was their time to be without kids. We were fortunate enough we had grandparents that were close and so they babysat us that. But as kids, mom and dad put up that healthy respect that this is what we're doing every Friday night. And, we have a babysitter, you will be good, you're taken care of, but you need to respect mommy and daddy's privacy. Just like we knew that when there was a closed door for anything. They didn't like to sleep in on Saturday, we got to watch cartoons, but it was respect the boundaries of whatever it was, and that was engraved early, and I am so glad it was. We tried to do the same with our kids too, because I saw the success in that.
Right.
That's good communication, but it is good model for them growing up and having those healthy boundaries put into place and knowing what's priority.
Absolutely. So then the other interesting piece that comes in are when adult children are coming back home. And let's say they get out on their own and they pick up smoking. I am allergic to it. I don't want that in my home. I'm not going to tell my kids they can't come home by any stretch. But they will respect the fact they're not smoking in my house. And so just, again, establishing that boundary, not using it to say, well, you have to quit smoking or you don't get to come home. No, because then that's controlling. That's not doing a boundary for my health. But when you're in my home, you're not going to do that here. You're going to go outside.
Or if you have pets that maybe they're allergic to or maybe just are very destructive or something, again, if you don't let me come with my pet, I'm not going to come. Well, then I guess that's your choice. But my boundary is, I want you here. I love you. And while I don't mind your pet, but your pet destroys everything, you're going to have to find somebody to take care of them.
And I think the other thing that can get into is when your kids have kids. And yes, I am a firm believer that the parents are the ones that establish the rules and they need to continue to be the parent, even at grandma and grandpa's house. And grandma and grandpa need to respect however mom and dad are parenting, as long as they're not allowing them to do stuff that's going to destroy the house or break some kind of rules. So, and I think that's where mom and dad and grandma and grandpa can talk about that, where that communication comes in and says, okay, well, we don't want the kids doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, we'll respect that. And then the parents handle that and get to parent. But then the grandparents don't get to be like, well, that's not how I did it. I mean, it goes both directions.
I laugh because I have a friend who I remember when she had grandkids, all of a sudden it was the kids knew there was grandma's rules, because they had rules at home, but then grandma had boundaries and rules there, and they knew. So maybe that's not the way they did act at home, but by golly, when they were at grandma's, they acted a certain way.
Right.
And
that was okay.
And if she went to their place, she didn't expect them to act the way they did at her place because they were at their place.
Right. It's just, again, being respectful of whose space it is and all of that, and requires good communication between the adults.
Let's bring it to the topic of friends then. Boundaries within friends. What does that look like? And that can be, I think, one of the hardest ones, because sometimes it doesn't seem like there's as set of boundaries. It's a lot more blurred. It's, when we think of, as we'll get later to romantic ones, so that's a little more set in stone, to some degree, or workplace. But friendship,
it can vary.
And it can be very easy to encroach or breach or push that boundary, to move it.
Well, and I think that's true, especially because friendships can vary so much. And then I think even just what we can expect from our friends and what society says we can expect from our friends, there's just so much difference and variation. And so it really does require a lot of good communication to know for sure where all those boundaries lie.
So say you live in town, which makes it a lot easier than out in the country, but you have a best friend who's like a neighbor. Even great, except for some people, crossing that boundary whenever they want to come in, knocking, not knocking, just coming in would be fine. But for some people, that's not fine.
Right.
And knowing that maybe just because you grew up that way, that you had a neighbor that always, you just turn around, oh, there they are, but maybe your neighbor, your best friend, that's not the way they were raised. No. You need to knock and pre-call ahead of time, or
warn me before you're coming over.
Give me a half a day to clean. No. Probably not that good a friend, but it's still, there is that boundary line. It's just how we were raised, the difference. And so that's that good communication. Again, we keep coming back to that.
I think we could almost do an entire episode on that.
I think so. For most of you out there, you may go, well, some of this sounds like common sense, but maybe I'm sure there's a whole lot of what not to do that we don't even realize that we're doing. So what would that look like?
As you mentioned, setting boundaries in friendship can be difficult. And I think probably, I would say, equally as difficult as it can be setting boundaries in a romantic relationship. And I think part of the reason for that is often, when we find someone who is a good friend or who has characteristics that we are excited to have, or we have great conversation, or just whatever it is, often the things that can draw you into a friendship can be similar to what would draw you into a romantic relationship. When you have that, then you can already begin to overlook some of those other red flags. And I think sometimes what can end up happening is you have a friend that you've established a friendship with, and there's a level of commitment or time invested with that person, and they seemed to be someone who was safe to allow in. Maybe you set boundaries originally and it seemed like it was okay, and then all of a sudden that line is getting shifted or moved or just blown out of the water, and it's unexpected. It doesn't seem to match what you knew of that person before. So then you're kind of confused, and you're left wondering, well, what do I do with this information? And sometimes you can end up in a situation where you're like, how did this happen? How did I get here? This is not the path that I saw happening, even in a friendship, in a close friendship, whatever that looks like, because then some of those other toxic traits can come into place. Because then that often goes hand in hand. If someone isn't willing to respect boundaries, 9 chances out of 10, that relationship is going to be toxic, because not respecting boundaries is sort of at the heart of what leads to that toxicity.
I think the big thing with friendships, why they can become unhealthy down the time, is because those boundaries weren't set, because there's that immediate attraction and it's fun and it's, you want to do all this stuff and you have all these things in common and everything's great and wonderful. And while you may talk about a lot of stuff, but because you become fast friends so quick, you never took that time to say, that really makes me feel uncomfortable, or maybe you just never even gave it a thought.
Right.
Or maybe you are bringing past trauma or stuff to the table and you haven't really worked through that, or you didn't realize that there'd be some things that'd be triggers.
Right.
If you find yourself in that, you're not alone. I mean, there's a lot of people that are experiencing this right now. But here's the thing. If you are really in a good relationship with them, there's nothing you can talk about.
Right.
You could, if you needed to set boundaries, like even now, you should be able to have that conversation and to say, again, I'm not putting up walls, this is a door, but this is my boundary that I need. And if you're truly good friends, the friend's going to respect that.
Right, absolutely.
And likewise, I'm so glad you said something, because I got boundaries of my own that I haven't been doing. So, but then that leads from friendship then to romantic relationships. Right now, one of the biggest ways that people are meeting their significant other is online.
It's true.
So that makes it even more difficult, or maybe not. I mean, because people are meeting online, they do a lot more talking and communicating long before they ever meet. Where it used to be somebody you just met on a blind date, or
right.
I mean, it was chance passing and you were already dating before you had that chance to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
But how many in there are actually in that communicating, setting boundaries?
Or actually talking about things that are going to be important for establishing what those boundaries are?
I would say that probably more than likely, and not just because women talk more, but I would think women probably establish those boundaries and communication sooner, because if they're talking online, they're going to be a little more maybe leery.
I would like to think. I don't know though.
No, maybe not.
I would like to think that that's the way it would be, that we would protect ourselves in this day and age. And, meet in a public place, or I'm not going to give you that information until I know that you're a safe person to share that information with.
Well, I was thinking I know that you had done that a couple times, but you had on there the non-negotiables.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
right away. So you were setting boundaries, and you're not the only one. I'd seen that on other ones too. These are the boundaries right from the beginning. Like, I'm a Christian. If you're not a Christian, then don't even bother, or this or this or this. And
I have kids. If you don't have any desire to have kids in your life, see you later,
And that may sound rude or crass, but it's not. You're just letting people know I'm not going to waste my time, and I don't want to waste your time.
Right. And I really feel like romantic relationships, you talked a little bit about that in friendship, but in romantic relationships in particular, that unhealthy pattern can be established so early. You are so excited to meet someone, and all of that's clicking and firing, and if there's chemistry and there's talking and whatnot, and all of a sudden your entire life and world revolves around each other. That is not sustainable. If you all of a sudden you're not hanging out with your friends, you're not talking hardly to your family, you're not putting in the hours at work that you normally, just like all of those different things, you can't keep that up.
Oh, and they get used to it. They think that's you.
That's the way it's going to look.
That's the way, it's going to be after I say I do and we move in, and then all of a sudden.
Even if it's just for a few months.
Yeah.
Because once the new wears off, which is good, because then that's where really and truly a relationship gets established, is once all the new wears off. But if you have invested everything, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, actually, I haven't done it for the last couple of months, but one night a week, or one night a month, all of us girls go out for the night and spend the night at someone's house, and we do this. And all of a sudden they're like, well, you haven't done that. You never mentioned that. Well, I don't want you to go do that. Or, anyways, you're changing.
You're like, I really worked like 50 hours at work, or 60 hours, or, oh yeah, by the way, I'm not usually home for supper because I work 10 hours or something like that. But wait a minute, that's not the way it was.
When things first started. And so just really being aware of that on your side of things, that you need to be genuine
You have to be genuine and be yourself from the very beginning,
Right.
because if you're trying to be what they think they want you to be,
you can't sustain that for the rest of your life. Think about that. However you're acting today, do you plan on doing that for the next 50 years? If not, then this is not a healthy start. So time is huge. We've talked about that in each of the different, having a social circle. When you first get into that relationship, realizing that you still need to have your friends and they need to still have their friends, and setting aside, okay, I'm going to hang out with my friends once a week, whatever that looks like, something that you're comfortable with.
Well, and maybe it was that you talk to your mom every day on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you weren't in a relationship with somebody else, that was fine.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe now, as you continue to go through life, your journey, as you continue to grow and go through life, that now you have others in there that you may have to say, oh, okay, my boundaries are going to have to change. Because maybe mom's been really good and she won't call you at work. She waits and calls you at night. Mm-hmm. But now, if I have someone else, I'm not going to totally dish mom, but say, you know what? Unless it's an emergency, I can really only carve out this night, or this amount of time, a half an hour instead of the hour to 2 hour, whatever.
Right.
So just things like that. You can change the boundaries as your life changes.
Absolutely.
That's particularly fun. And then you get into kids and, your life is going to change and you cannot sustain what you were doing before you were even married.
Right.
Where you're at down the road.
And I think that's an important piece of it. It's important, yes, some boundaries should be non-negotiable. When I'm at work, no one is going to, really anywhere in this world. If I don't give you permission to touch me, don't touch me. Thanks. We can have those boundaries and those don't have to change. But boundaries, particularly within friendships, within relationships, if there's rigidity to them in ways that are not healthy, then that can become, again, a different mean of control and that kind of thing.
When I think of within a romantic relationship too, how you know when that person is the one that truly loves you is when you say from the beginning, you know what? I'm saving sex until marriage. Mm-hmm. I believe in abstinence. I believe in what the Bible preaches. And so that's what, and they should hopefully, if you're looking for one and being yoked of like-minded, they'll be in the same way, which helps keep those boundaries even more secure if you both have kind of the same boundaries. But if they don't, and they keep pushing, and they keep forcing, and they keep saying, or maybe even they have a family that keeps encouraging other behavior than what you are saying, then the family's no longer respecting your boundaries. Instead of people supporting you, upholding you, they're degrading you and making you feel like you're the loser, you're the bad one for having morals or having your own boundaries. And this is where it becomes so difficult, because while inside your head, that, what, I should probably walk away. But yet if your heart's invested, that's when those lines become blurred. That's when the boundaries all of a sudden dissolve. Mm-hmm. And you end up doing things that later you regret. You wish you hadn't done. And when you go back and you go, well, how did it all happen? You can really go all the way back, when you didn't have those solid boundaries still set into place.
It doesn't usually even, I would say, start with a physical boundary in that respect. But what if you say, we use the horror movies. What if you're like, I absolutely hate them. They give me nightmares. I can't watch them. And every other weekend when you guys going out, they're asking me, oh, come on. Or, back in our day when you could rent a movie, they bring home a movie, or they get on Amazon and they're looking at horror movies, and they're always constantly pushing, or, oh, just come on, I'll be right here, it'll be fine. And then, so that's a boundary they're not respecting, which you're like, well, it's just movies, but it's establishing a pattern. Let's say you say, I've been to that restaurant a couple of times and the food made me sick and the service was terrible. I don't want to go back. And they're not going to let it go. They try to take you there and again, those seem like minor things. But if you I always tell my kids, if I can't trust you on the little stuff, then I can't trust you on the big stuff. And it's the same thing. So paying attention to those little things and recognizing that that is the beginning of a pattern. And that is showing you how much respect they really have for you. Mm-hmm. And pushing through boundaries is not one.
Let's move it then to marriage. Mm-hmm. And why I do that is because this one can be very difficult, because there may be a lot of people who feel like, well, since we've gotten married and we are not one flesh, that we just have to do whatever the other person wants. And that's not true.
No.
There are still and can be boundaries within the marriage. Sex is a big one. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, anything can go in a marriage as long as both people are in agreement. Mm-hmm. If one person is not in agreement, then that is a boundary, and that should not be crossed. And there needs to be a lot of communication with that. There needs to be the respect. Mm-hmm. And otherwise, because if they say, well, since you're my spouse, then that means I can do whatever. No, that's called control and a lot of other issues. Mm-hmm. But time or money's another one. I mean, there can be boundaries, because just because, let's say, if you have one that's a spender, mm-hmm. But you have monthly bills. The boundary is, well, I will give you an allowance, but we have to have X amount of money to pay the monthly bills. Mm-hmm. And those are boundaries that can't be crossed, because if they are, then you're just going to end up in a mess.
And it could even be saying, okay, well, this isn't working out for us to have a joint account, so I'm going to take and have an account that all of the monthly bills are going to be paid for, and whatever you do with that, that's on you. You know what I mean? Establishing that, which maybe for some of you sounds just really odd and crazy, but I can tell you that absolutely happens in lots of relationships where there is one person that just
can't handle money.
Right, just can't. And so then it has to become about setting a boundary and saying, I'm going to make sure we have a roof over our head and we have food on the table. And so that has to be established in that way.
And the same thing goes for friends or smoking or drinking or gambling. I mean, whatever it is, if there is, in a healthy relationship, there is boundaries. Mm-hmm. This is, well, again, if you're going to go play the lottery every week, well, the boundary is you're only spending X amount, mm-hmm. and you don't cross that. Mm-hmm. I don't want you getting drunk, because that's then violating my boundary at home if it's becoming a thing.
Right.
I know we're kind of getting into other areas, but there can be boundaries. Mm-hmm. Or just like you said with smoking, mm-hmm. I can't maybe tell you not to smoke, because unless you started doing it after we got married, but you're going to do it outside, or right. You're going to,
because you're not going to jeopardize my health, because that would be a boundary. I can say, I don't want smoking in the house because that jeopardizes my health. I can't tell you not to do it, but you're not going to put my health or our kids' health at risk, mm-hmm. by doing it in the house.
Or maybe they have a friend that is just really vulgar and maybe is trying to make passes at you, whatever. Just, you know the type. And you're like, you know what, honey, that's fine. If he's your friend, that's great, but he's not coming over here. Mm-hmm. And that's just a boundary you have to respect.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And those, again, require good communication and a healthy respect for each other so that you can have those conversations.
So what does the Bible say about all this? Well, there are some scriptures. From Proverbs 4:23, Solomon has some pretty good advice. He says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. And that is so powerful, because when we allow those boundaries to get pushed, to get knocked down, to have people walk through, we're going to make different decisions. We're going to go down a different path.
It can make you end up places you never would have imagined. It really can. Because when someone blows through your boundaries, it hurts. Especially if it's within a friendship or a relationship and there was trust established. It really can derail the course of things.
So why we decided to do the boundaries today is because we thought it was a really good follow-up kind of to the toxic relationships, mm-hmm. because there is a lot of hand in hand with that. How do toxic people continue to become more toxic and control people is because the other ones just don't have those firm boundaries set in place, and they don't say this is what's off limits. Mm-hmm. And they know that. They kind of capitalize.
They do. Well, one thing that we haven't really touched on yet that we talked about a little bit beforehand, is boundaries without consequences are just words. They're just words. So if you establish your boundaries and you guys have those communications and someone blows through them, but you never follow back up and talk about it, you don't let them know, hey, you did that, that's not acceptable. And then if it continues to happen, nothing changes, then they don't respect your boundaries, because, well, it could be a million things. It'd be, maybe they changed their boundaries, maybe they were just joking, maybe it could be anything. It could be anything. Or maybe they just don't care.
Maybe you got a friend or a sister-in-law or somebody who's constantly calling you up at the last second when you need to babysit, and then not respecting your boundaries at all. And if the consequence is, if you don't start respecting my boundaries, then I'm not going to be able to watch your kid when you want them at the last minute. Well, if you say that, but then you don't follow through with that,
right,
it means nothing.
It does. Yeah, your actions and words have to match.
So we hope that I am sure for any and everyone out there listening, there's a plethora of things that have been going through your head as you were thinking about this, going, oh yeah, either you know someone or you're like, maybe I need to do a better job at that. This is the good thing, because life, especially with God, it's never too late. Oh my gosh, we have every day is a new start. And so maybe you're the one that goes, yeah, you know what? I did have boundaries and I don't know what I did. I just let everybody walk all over me and walk through them. But you can start now. You can start today. The big thing is communication. You just need to let people know that, so that way they don't have a clue that they've done something wrong. You got to say, hey, you know what? I know, I'm sorry, but I've done some thinking and some changing, and this is what I want for me. This is really going to be my boundaries, and I would appreciate if you would respect that. Or maybe you're the person out there going, oh man, I was the one blowing through boundaries and didn't even realize that, because that's not the way I grew up, but I didn't think about that maybe other people didn't have that, or whatever. Or maybe you're a spouse that goes, oh, well, I didn't know that we could still have healthy boundaries even within a relationship.
Right.
That can be a game changer for so many people. There's so many divorces out there that if little things like this was done all along. What's the two biggest reasons for divorce? It's sex and it's money. And I would throw in any more time.
Oh, 100%.
Especially with all the technology and everything we have. If healthy boundaries are put into place, just think how many those marriages would not end in divorce if there was more communication and healthy boundaries put into place at the very beginning. And you might not have married that toxic person or somebody who didn't respect you enough to respect those boundaries if you had them up in the first place.
Right.
Hopefully you have gleaned something out of our ramblings that we've had today.
And boundaries is a tough thing. It was a tough thing to talk about, a tough thing to figure out how to communicate the importance of them in all of your relationships, but just know they are a vital piece of any healthy relationship, and establishing them early is important. But if you haven't had them before, getting them established now, it's never too late.
It's never too late. So in honor of today's topic, that's why we wore our Hang On, Let Me Overthink This t-shirts, because this isn't something you need to overthink. Spend a little bit of time and know what those boundaries are that work for you. And then don't overthink it. Just share it with others. So until next time,
Shalom.